Hello, everyone. Welcome. People are coming in. I'll just wait a few more seconds. It's a little bit before 7. Um, but as people are coming in, if you'd like to tell us where you're tuning in from, we always like to know. I'm sure we have a lot of people from Connecticut, but we have people who receive our newsletter who are members from all over the country. So if you'd like to let us know where you're tuning in from, what brought you here this evening. Um, And you could just do that in the chat. Feel free to speak with each other as well. Of course, we can remain civil. Watertown, Mass. Excellent. Terryville, Connecticut. Welcome. Oh, Steve. Hi, Steve.
We know him.
Yes. Oh, Julie. Hi, Julie. A lot of familiar names, of course. Welcome to everyone. I'll go ahead and get started, and people will keep coming in. Um, Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for In the Arena, Theodore Roosevelt in War, Peace, and Revolution. Now, virtual programs like this are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord, and we are grateful to honor his memory with these programs. And I also want to say a quick thank you to our members. I know there are quite a few of you here this evening. If you're not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. And you can do that by visiting our website or just reach out to us and we'll get you to the right people. Now, during this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat, as I said a few seconds ago. But if you have a specific question, please post that directly into the Q&A section. It's down at the bottom. There's a little box with a question mark in it. You can ask your question at any time whenever it comes up for you. You don't have to wait. It can be during the conversation. And we'll get to it in about 45 minutes after the main discussion wraps up. So our guest today is David S. Brown. He teaches history at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. He is the author of 8 books, including A Hell of a Storm, The Battle for Kansas, The End of Compromise, and The Coming of the Civil War. The First Populist, The Defiant Life of Andrew Jackson. The Last American Aristocrat, The Brilliant Life and Improbable Education of Henry Adams, and biographies of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Richard Hofstadter. And Jeffrey L. Nichols is the moderator for this evening. He is the executive director of the Mark Twain House and Museum. Prior to his current position, he was the CEO of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the executive director of Georgetown Heritage in Washington, D.C., and president and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest in Virginia. Now, I will turn this over to David and Jeff, and I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Omar. Welcome, David. Nice to see you again.
Good to be with you, Jeff.
I mentioned seeing David again because,
Mhm.
as Omar mentioned, I was the director at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And just last year, we spoke about his last book, A Hell of a Storm, at a local bookstore in Harrisburg. And obviously, when I saw your name appear tied to a Teddy Roosevelt book, knowing the connection to the Mark Twain's era, as well as the interactions he had with Mark Twain, it was something I had to recommend that we bring to the museum. I'm glad it's worked out. So it's great to see you again and welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Always good to talk with you.
So, obviously you're a very busy writer and you've worked on a lot of books as well as being a full-time teacher. Um, but what inspired you to write about Theodore Roosevelt, and what drew you to him as your current subject?
A few years ago, I was writing a biography of Henry Adams. Henry Adams was different altogether, different generation. He's about 20 years older than Roosevelt and came from a Brahmin family, the Adams family, in Quincy, Boston area. And yet Adams and Roosevelt, they were neighbors in Washington, D.C. And they would sometimes write about each other to other people. And Henry Adams had a kind of a dry, witty slash caustic sense of humor. And his takes on Roosevelt, not unlike Mark Twain's dry, caustic takes on Roosevelt, they sort of drew me a little bit into Roosevelt in a way that I hadn't thought about Roosevelt before. I'd thought about Roosevelt, taught about Roosevelt as a political figure. And Adams got me to think more about Roosevelt as a cultural figure, even a cultural symbol. And I'm also interested in intellectual history, cultural history. And so here's Roosevelt, who is this president, but he also becomes something of a emblematic figure to Americans at the turn of the century. He becomes this figure who is recognized as a warrior. Yet he also wins the Nobel Prize for Peace. And he's recognized as someone who brings forth, in an age of emerging industrialization, this progressive reform to begin to, quote unquote, tame the trusts and beat back monopolization. So there were certain ironies that were there. And so I think it was Adams, I think it was Twain, and I think it was also just the ebullient, unpredictable, sometimes erratic personality of Theodore Roosevelt. I spent 5 years researching and writing the book, so it's good when you're interested and your subject can fascinate you.
Yeah, and when we were waiting for the meeting to begin, I chatted with you and talked about how much living he really piled into his 60 years. And just again, if you haven't seen the book, here's the cover. It's available on our website. So if you want to purchase a copy, you can certainly do it by visiting our website. But can you tell us a little bit about his childhood? Where was he born? Who were his parents? That type of thing. And what was his general background?
Yeah, it's an interesting background because his mother was a Southern belle from a Georgia plantation, and his father came from an old Dutch patroon family, um, financial, real estate, merchant wealth. So there was money there, and there was a privileged background. And yet he and his three siblings, a brother and two sisters, they came of age as children during the American Civil War. And they sort of wanted it both ways. They obviously wanted to recognize and respect the families on both sides. And yet Roosevelt did say in a memoir, we did have a pony when I was a child, and the pony was called Pony Grant. And so ultimately, they sided with the Union there. Um, he went to Harvard. People of his class tended to do that, and he became very interested in public service. Um, he wanted to get involved in politics because he said, I want to be part of the ruling class. Even in an age of emerging democracy, when some of the men at Harvard said, politics, that's that's bruising. That's not a sporty thing to do. Roosevelt decided that he would be an intellectual, he would write history, he would engage in politics, he would honor his family, particularly his father, by being a civic leader. And his father had been a civic leader in New York. And yet he would parlay this outside of the theater of Manhattan politics. And he would take these values that he said he got from his father and also from his mother, and he would become a president that was interested in Victorian values, in fair play. Now, this might sound like rhetoric, but Roosevelt was very serious about this. He took his Victorian upbringing quite seriously. He took the fact that uh, he he could see himself as the president of all the people in a way that he believed that no one really could since the American Civil War because of his mixed background. And he felt, in some sense, that he was the first president since before the Civil War to recognize and represent all of the American people. And this, I think, comes into a sense of belonging in the family to a quote unquote mixed family. And then looking at a heterogeneous, diverse nation and seeing himself as a symbolic figure who could who could help this long process of reconstruction and sectional healing and bring this country together again. He'll also make some noise about doing that with his service in the Spanish-American War and how this is a war that will bring the country back together again. In some respects, yes, but obviously in many other respects, no, and it's a bit of a self-serving narrative. It's also a war that will help to perpetuate um, lost cause mythology in the American South, for example. So Roosevelt has, as we all do, a a sense of self and a preferred narrative. And like many of us, this goes back to the crib. This goes back to who his family was, where his parents came from, and this becomes part of his identity, filtered through the lens of a Northern education, filtered through the lens of military service, and then finally a political career. But I think Roosevelt would say that he was really a creature of his upbringing.
And as a child as well, he battled some health issues. Asthma, I believe, was the main thing. And you mentioned he wanted to have this sort of political life and thoughtful life, but he was also very much trying to build his own strength and be engaged in the world. And obviously, his hunting expeditions and various things, which we'll talk about. But what was interesting early on, you talk about him as being, referred to as sort of a dude. And can you talk a little bit about that and how the his health and him trying to build his own strength physically over as a child kind of impacted his life? Because there's this other side of him as well.
Sure. Yeah, that's all part of the Roosevelt narrative. Before historians will begin to write about this in the 20th century, Roosevelt had already written about that in his memoir, the idea of overcoming illness, of his father sitting down and saying to him, Theodore, you've got a lot of advantages, but these advantages won't matter without health. You must make your body. And so Roosevelt, as you note, a sickly child with asthma, with the help of his parents and a jungle gym put in the top floor of the family's Manhattan house, began to remake his body. I'd also note, and I make some reference to this in the book, that for my money, it was his older sister, Bammy, who overcame, as best she could, Pott's disease and ended up surprising all the Roosevelts, who thought that she would just be the daughter of a wealthy person, a sickly woman. She ended up being her brother's maybe best out of government advisor. She married late in life, early 40s, had a child, and was really a resourceful person. And she too fits into the narrative of the Roosevelt who was sick and who overachieved. She doesn't get as much play because, well, she's a woman. She wasn't president, and people didn't look at things that way at that time. You mentioned the dude. This was really a term back then.
Yeah.
To be a dude was to be all decked out. Roosevelt, whether he was at Harvard, whether he was a member of the New York Assembly, whether he was governor, he liked to dress very fine, had the means to do so, was a bit of a peacock. It wasn't just that he bought nice clothing, which he did, much of it was handmade, but he wanted to impress and he wanted to grab the eye. And so there might be, for example, some gold. There might be bell-bottom trousers. There might be tight-fitting clothes. And he knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to make an entrance. He wanted to gain people's attention. And he knew how to do that, both sartorially, rhetorically, and probably other ways as well. The narrative of overcoming ill health, this becomes part of a larger narrative of the man who goes off to war when he's in his early 40s. He's got a large family. He doesn't have to. It becomes the narrative of the man who, after his presidency, goes to the Amazon in South America, in Brazil, and is charting the so-called River of Doubt and says, it was my last chance to be a boy, which would be his equivalent then as a somewhat older man who can't quite pull off the dude look like he used to, but of catching the eye and doing the impossible, or at least what people said he should not try to do.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that about boyhood, and one of Mark Twain's critiques of Theodore Roosevelt was that he was sort of the Tom Sawyer come to life, paraphrasing. But, so it sort of fits in, even though Mark Twain is sort of critically looking at him, it sort of is who he was. He had this sort of big child aspect to him as well, or wanting to be an adventurous life, which is just fascinating. But he wasn't, his life wasn't without trouble, as all lives are. Can you talk about his first wife, Alice Lee, his beginning of his political career as well around that era, and what happened on February 4th? I think it was February 14th of 1884.
Yeah, he met Alice when he was an undergraduate at Harvard, and she was part of a prominent Boston family, and they um, uh, they married after a couple of years, and she wasn't probably his first pick. The woman who would be his second wife, he probably asked her to marry him when he was an undergraduate. He did so shortly after the death of his father, and we've already discussed a little bit how much his father meant to him. Whether um, this woman felt that, and this is Edith Roosevelt, felt that it was unflattering that he was just unstable, unsure after the death of his father, and was quickly asking her to marry him. She had been a family friend. We're not exactly sure, but she said no. And then he very quickly will alight on to Alice Lee in Boston. There's a courtship. She initially says no, politely, which was a signal that he could continue. And they will get married. Um, they'll do the de rigueur honeymoon in Europe, where she had never been, but he was a child of privilege. He had been there twice as a kid, and it was kind of a pro forma trip for him. And they have a family, but not for a long time. As you mentioned, um, February 14th, Valentine's Day. This also becomes part of the Roosevelt narrative. His mother and his wife, they die on the same day. Wife dies giving birth to Roosevelt's eldest child. This is Alice Roosevelt, obviously named after her mother. Um, this occurs in February of 1886, and Alice will live until 1980. She had a very long life, and Roosevelt will later remarry. Actually, not that much longer. He swore, as a good Victorian, that he would never remarry again. And after he did, he wrote to one of his sisters saying, I'm not sure if I really hope that there's a heaven or not, because there is, and I get there. What if both of my spouses are there? It
Hmm.
sounds a little bit like a joke, but he was nervous about this, not in a literal sense, but I think I think in some way he let himself down. I think in some ways he wanted to be the stoic who could suffer a great loss like that and keep to his principle, his word, even if that principle or the word was just to himself. No one else expected him to really do that. Although later on in life, one of his great nemesis was President Woodrow Wilson. And one of the things he didn't really like about Wilson was that Wilson's first wife died when he was president in office. And I think it was about a year or so later that Wilson remarried. And neither Roosevelt um, nor his friend Henry Cabot Lodge in the Senate, neither appreciated that. And so when we think about the politics of that time, Roosevelt running against Wilson, Lodge's opposition in the Senate to Wilson's efforts to create a League of Nations and the 14 points, it doesn't all go back to Wilson remarrying, but there was something there about Victorian propriety, even in
Hmm.
the 20th century. And someone like Roosevelt wanted to hang on to that. And I think the remarriage showed him, in a sense, how he himself could come up short on that front. It was a very high bar he was trying to set for himself.
Yeah, and I think I also remember reading in the book that he also criticized other people for remarrying shortly after their yeah. So that fits right in, and it wouldn't be the first time he changed his mind or did the opposite of what he said or what he thought. Again, like most of us in many ways. And his political career starts. I think he starts as a New York assemblyman, and then he has a job in New York City. And he at this point really becomes. I think you touched on this briefly, it's the beginning of it, but really opposed to the spoil system of government uh, um, positions, jobs, and how they were doled out really for political reasons. Can you talk a little bit about that work in New York? And then get up to the election of 1884, which involved the mugwumps, which Mark Twain was one of those. So please, if you could kind of bridge that gap for us.
Yeah, Roosevelt viewed himself as someone who was coming from a Republican Party background. He absolutely loved Lincoln. His father had some Lincoln relics. That is, a couple of letters. Um, had had known Lincoln just very briefly. His father had during his father's service to his country during the American Civil War. And Roosevelt always said to his dying day, Lincoln is my ideal, the statesman. So he could never be a Democrat. He could only be a Republican. But he viewed himself very much as an independent Republican. That's what the Mugwumps were. So, in effect, Roosevelt really was kind of a proto or an early Mugwump. But then you mentioned, in 1884, and Roosevelt is pushing, along with Lodge, who I mentioned earlier, as young, up and coming Republicans, a reform candidate because they argue, as do many others in the party, that their party has simply become too attached to patronage and not enough to talent. And what they want is to elect a Republican who is going to just put best best person, or back then, of course, best man for the job. Well, that's not where politics was moving at all. Politics was moving, and really had been since about 1800, towards machine politics. We see this happen with the emergence of political parties in the 1790s. And this just continues to evolve and spool out. So ultimately, Roosevelt has to make a decision in 1884. Will he support a quote unquote regular Republican, or will he continue to push for a reform Republican? And if he can't get the reform Republican, which he couldn't as a young politician, would he bolt the party? And I mentioned, a few minutes ago that his decision to remarry, in a sense, he kind of called his own bluff. In the political sense, the same thing happens in 1884 when he decides that as a young man, he actually would like to have a political career. And to do so, he has to be in line with his party. He can't really be a maverick and move ahead. And so he bites the bullet and he will back James G. Blaine, the liar, continental liar from Maine, as he was called, because he was seen as something of a corrupt candidate. I think 1884 is also a preface for explaining why Roosevelt, who is one of the country's most popular presidents to this day, and a widely popular president with Republican voters, was never embraced by his party hierarchy and only became president because the guy in front of him, President McKinley, was, of course, assassinated. Because the power structure in the party, they never trusted Roosevelt. They always saw him as a maverick. They always saw him as too independent. And looking at it from their perspective, they were probably right.
Yeah, I think you could see that in the book. Absolutely. A bit of a loose cannon at times, and certainly someone who had strong opinions and a strong opinion of himself as well. There's no question about that, that he had an ego that also sort of drove him forward, as many politicians, particularly when you get to that level have. Um, yeah, and as I mentioned, Mark Twain had a similar view of patronage at that point, and he did end up going and support the Democrat Grover Cleveland even campaigned for him a little bit. So they chose slightly different paths. Their paths cross several more times over the next 20 years or so. So as he's making his way through all these political machinations, he's also at times heading out west. He has a ranch out west. He becomes sort of a rancher and partakes in that. Again, that strenuous life that he wrote about is part of it. But he also becomes in the 1890s the assistant secretary, I believe, of the U.S. Navy. And so as his political career begins to move up and he gets more to a federal level, and he at that point he's a big advocate for a stronger and more expansive, as he put it, a big Navy. Can you talk about that phase of his life? And then I think it was 1895 under President McKinley.
Yeah, I think that Roosevelt was always thinking of America as as a nation that needed to expand um, out of its sort of continental place, and it could only do that with a big navy. When Roosevelt was a young man, actually still in Harvard, and he was working on a book completely apart from his scholastic work at the university, and he would eventually publish that. And it was a study on the United States Navy during the War of 1812. And the argument there was that the United States had to have a big navy. Its goals, its designs, its desires, it required that. So here he is now in the 1890s in a position to begin to put some of those ideas together. It's easy to look at Roosevelt through the lens of the Spanish-American War, and then through the buildup of the Navy, and then in his late presidential days, turning loose the Great White Fleet of battleships to circle the earth, and say that Roosevelt sort of came to this through power, but not really. He came to this when he was in his 20s. I think he had this long standing, this reflexive desire to see American power expand. And where it would expand to was very clear to people in the late 19th century. It was the Pacific. Um, up, for early American history, it was the Atlantic world. It was the two wars with Great Britain. And then for a while, including into Roosevelt's time, it was the Caribbean. It was Florida. It was the Seminole Wars. It was the Louisiana Purchase. It was Texas. But by the late 19th century, the Pacific looked to be the next frontier for America. And a lot of Americans, including Mark Twain, were not interested in that. They thought that was a rejection of the country's Republican roots and really foundation as a nation that comes into being essentially in a great anti-colonial revolt. Roosevelt seems to think that colonization is in the country's destiny. We're not using terms like manifest destiny in 1900 or 1910. The language changes, but the quest for empire, it does not. And a big navy is according to Roosevelt, the very lifeblood of the country's future.
And certainly that will play out, and Mark Twain, his role in that. And you mentioned about Mark Twain's views, and it's really interesting. And we're up to basically that sort of next stage of Theodore Roosevelt's life with the explosion of the Maid in Cuba and the beginning of the Spanish American War. And at the very beginning of the war, it's interesting. There's a quote from Mark Twain from about October 1900, and he talks about when he left these shores, he was traveling abroad. He referred to himself as a red hot imperialist. That he wanted to support these programs, this work, and because he viewed it as the United States liberating these societies, throwing off the shackles of imperialism, as we did as a young nation. So going to Cuba and liberating them, and then leaving, even the Philippines, which we'll talk about in some detail, I hope, at the beginning of that, he wasn't necessarily opposed. It wasn't until the turn was made from being liberators to being occupiers, and we'll talk all about that. But just taking a quick step back to get this rolling, Teddy Roosevelt was still Assistant Secretary of the Navy when that war broke out. And we all know now that, of course, he didn't stay in that position. Can you talk a bit about his journey from that post to San Juan Hill and what that did to benefit his career?
Yeah, I guess I'll reference his father again. His father had been able to pay $300 to buy himself out of a combat role during the Civil War. His father did do yeoman service. He helped to design a program which would give soldiers the opportunity to put their pay, portion of it aside, which should go back to their families. This would help morale. Um, Roosevelt, he respected all of that. But one of his sisters once wrote that she believed that the fact that the father didn't serve was extra incentive for the son to serve. Now, this was the year that Roosevelt turned 40, the year that the war begins. Roosevelt could have sat that out easily. Um, uh, he, well, he couldn't because he's Theodore Roosevelt. But
Exactly. Yeah.
his friends and his family thought that he was nuts. Henry Adams said, "Yeah, the man's crazy. What's he doing here?" Um, his wife just delivered their last child, so there were five children now, many of them quite small. His wife had had a difficult birth and pregnancy, and she was not doing very well physically, and there was some question about her future. It's in that circumstance that Roosevelt basically just goes to the front line. Um, he told someone later on, he said, basically, this was what I was made to do. And there's nothing, including family obligations, that could keep me from this. This is one of the reasons why I chose that term, in the arena. He viewed himself as quintessentially person of action in the arena. And so he will become an officer in a volunteer cavalry force, which we still had back then. It was the romantic notion that we have, obviously, the professional army, but we also have this kind of echo of the Minutemen from way back. And Roosevelt became an officer in this force. He had a very significant ego. I think that's probably fair to say, but he was shrewd enough to recognize that he probably should not be the reigning officer, the commanding officer. So he took a secondary role. Kind of did what he wanted to do in the field, but but he took a secondary role here. And so it is this Rough Rider contingent which will go to Cuba, and which will, I hesitate to say it'll make Roosevelt's name. Roosevelt had a name up to that time, but this war really made him a war hero. It makes him a national figure.
And he comes out of that as exactly that. Yeah, he runs for or becomes governor of New York for a couple of years, and then um, is elected as vice president under McKinley as well in 1900. And as you mentioned, just a few short months after that, McKinley is assassinated, and Teddy becomes president of the United States. And so as he becomes president, he's inheriting some of these issues that are going on, including the current war. He also, though, during his presidency, um, begins to confront some of those other issues that you mentioned earlier. Well, I think you used the term predatory wealth, monopolies, trusts during his presidency. Can you talk a bit about that as well? And maybe what a little bit about the transition of how he became president and what that was like for him personally, and
Sure.
what he did to move forward.
Yeah. So basically, with the economy, law had not caught up with the industrial state. In many respects, the laws were still kind of geared towards um, the late 18th, early 19th century, small, decentralized agrarian republic. Well, by the turn of the century, the United States was an industrial power. It had a very sophisticated financial system, most of it private, and law had not caught up with that yet. Labor law, protection for consumers, for example. And so Roosevelt, again, being a bit of a maverick, um, not being part of the new money, not a Carnegie, not a Rockefeller, not a JP Morgan, but old money, I think had a sense of paternalism that his class, and this is not unlike Henry Adams and the Adams family, that they embodied something that was true about America, that America was a country of fair play, equal opportunity. They didn't use terms like American dream back then, but something along those lines, and that it was this new industrial system that was constricting, choking off competition with monopolization, making it hard for Americans to uh, well to get ahead. And so he will cut against much of the thinking of his own party and pursue policy that we come today to call progressivism. Um, uh, Probably most people who voted Republican were very much for this. He'll win election on his own right, 1904, 56% of the vote. Probably at least half the people in the Republican Party did not really want to go along with this. And there was a core known as the Old Guard. And they were very much opposed to this, but they just had to wait out his presidency. Um, he was a much different president than McKinley. Um, Roosevelt was charismatic. McKinley kind of looked like a small town undertaker. Um, Kinley was very much part of that kind of old guard regime. He was elevated to the presidency in part to get the nomination because he had pushed for and gotten a really high tariff, which would help the financiers and the industrialists. And Roosevelt was of the mind that tariff, it has its place, industry has its place, but perhaps it's too high. Whenever Roosevelt wanted to pick a fight with a Republican who he thought might be blocking him in some way, be it McKinley or later on William Howard Taft, who he essentially elevated to the presidency, but then would oppose him and run against him for the presidency, he attacked them for being essentially shills for the old guard and not being in line with the sentiment of what most people in the Republican Party wanted. And he always knew that. If you doubted that, you could just ask him, and he would tell you very specifically what he thought the people in the party wanted. And it was essentially whatever he thought the people in the party needed.
Mhm. And there's as reading this book and thinking about today, you begin to see parallels between his presidency and the current president, and how, in some manner, it's very interesting. And you write about that. We'll talk about that at the very end. But also just to do one last piece on his the imperialism and Mark Twain's view of that. As I mentioned, Mark Twain was in favor of these wars of liberation until they changed, and it really was the Philippine conquest after the Battle of Manila Bay, and the Spanish were removed, and there was a peace treaty, and he was for that. But once we began to really suppress the people of the Philippines and conquer it, is when he turned. And Mark Twain referred to the Philippines issues as a mess and a quagmire. One of my favorite Twain quotes comes from this time too, which is, "I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." And he wrote about a whole story called "The Person Sitting in Darkness," which was his reaction to this. But he was in a distinct minority. The wars and the resolution of them were popular with the most of the people in the country. And bring it full circle, there was even an issue with Venezuela at the time where some European nations were blockading it, and we didn't get involved, but he certainly had to deal with that. So this era of the great powers having their spheres of influence was certainly part of that mixture. And Twain wasn't just writing about the Philippines; he was writing about what was happening in China with the Boxer Rebellion, as well as what was going on in South Africa. So it's really interesting that connection and how the two men reacted to it. So as his presidency goes on, and a couple of people mentioned that to me. I've seen some of the questions, but it wasn't just the politics of imperialism and of monopolies and trusts, but he was also really a conservationist in many ways, as we would consider today. Can you talk about some of his work, his love of nature, and his preservation efforts?
Yeah, the love was sincere. When he went out to the Dakota Territory, he fell in love with the landscape, and he bought himself a ranch. He was a gentleman farmer, but he lived the life of a rancher when he was out there. The men that he worked with were amazed that this dude would put in the hours, and then would go hunting for weeks on end, living in tents and whatnot. Um, he he toured America, an extensive trip when he was president. Was gone for weeks and weeks and weeks. Um, Went to meet John Muir, the so-called mountain mystic, and fell in love with the West Coast, and did a very good thing, of course, by setting aside millions and millions and millions of acres for the preservation. I think that this has also to do with his philosophy of the strenuous life, the idea that in an industrialized culture, where will our quote unquote fighting values come from? One could interpret that in a military sense, although I think with Roosevelt, I think the term fighting is broader than that. That could be fighting for your rights. That could be fighting for what's right at a city council meeting. And he was concerned that Americans would become machine soft and machine slack, and to have recourse to nature. I mean, this almost sounds Thoreauvian, that nature would be able to rejuvenate us. I think he was a great believer in that. And so for him, conservation was a way to preserve and exemplify what was best in Americans. And if we lost that, then where would we be? And he thought that we would no longer really be Americans. We would be more like Europeans. You can find this concern in other ways, in the American past. Will we have our own literature? Well, Twain answered that question.
Yeah, yeah.
Will we have our own vernacular? Will we have our own culture? What will set us apart from other peoples, even other industrial peoples? And for Roosevelt, one way to answer that was we have this large continent, and so much of it is open and should be open and remain open for the people.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. It brings back to mind Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote the Notes of the State of Virginia, and it was really a sort of answer to a European talking about how sort of backwards the country is, but he's comparing things in the United States to Europe, and of course, somehow ours miraculously come out on top for the most part. So you're right about this theme. He's also a writer. We really haven't talked about that. He's a published historian and writer, and he's very successful. Writes about his various travels. But you would get to the end of his presidency, leaving as a popular figure. He did swear that he would never run again for office. Right? He did win re-election, overwhelming re-election. But then, part of that is that strenuous life. He leaves the stage for a while and goes on an African safari. And he has contracts to write a book. He has a contract with several museums to collect specimens. And one of the most interesting parts about this is that he writes as he's leaving for this that he doesn't want to go and collect, kill too many animals. He wants to be sort of conserved about that. He had I believe his son went and others. They killed 500 animals, and he thought that wasn't a lot. and brought them back. But again, that idea of the personality of his that strenuous life. Um, Many people thought his political career was over, but it wasn't. Can you talk about what was happening at the end of the Taft administration, who was his successor, and the election of what 1914?
1912. Yeah.
I'm sorry, 1912. Thank you.
Yeah. So the only reason that Roosevelt stopped being president was because George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or somebody in the past never ran for 3 terms. And so I mentioned those Victorian proprieties. One of them, in a way, was that, well, there's no constitutional amendment yet that says you can't run for more than 2 terms, but nobody had done it before. So he just sort of stepped aside and he said to the Republican Party, I'd like Taft to be my successor. And that's what happened. But there were other commentators who said, hey, I bet in 4 years, I bet Roosevelt might make a run for it. And that's what Roosevelt did. He basically picked a quarrel, a policy quarrel with Taft. Taft was like the nicest guy in politics. And Taft, could see this fight coming and dreaded it, but knew it was there, knew it was upon him. So when Roosevelt challenges Taft, the old guard, they're not going to let Roosevelt get this nomination. Really, Roosevelt he didn't earn it. Back then, I think there were 13 primaries. Roosevelt won most of the primaries. Roosevelt, he did probably have the support of most garden variety Republicans around the country, but that's not how the system worked back then. It was essentially up to most of the states to determine who they would support. And most of these state delegations were loyal to the regular Republican Party. And so at the convention, it was not really surprising. Roosevelt did not get enough votes. Roosevelt claims that the nomination had essentially been stolen from him, and he will split the party, and he'll run as a progressive slash bull moose candidate, which means that the party is essentially split, and whoever runs from the Democratic Party, even a Southern Democrat. I mean, the country had not elected a Southern Democrat since the 1840s. I think it was like James K. Polk or something like that. Even a Southern Democrat could and did win the election, Woodrow Wilson.
And so that leaves it was a very bitter pill for Roosevelt as well. I think he understood because of the divided nature of the Republicans, they probably wouldn't win, but still it was again something that was challenging for him. And I saw a comment that mentioning that he then goes on a trip to the Amazon. So he went to Africa between his presidency and running again, and then to the Amazon in 1914. Very strenuous, very challenging trip. His health fails during it, and he never really recovers fully from that trip. And it was strenuous. He's in his mid-50s at this point. He comes back, and can you talk briefly about his final years, his views of Woodrow Wilson as a pacifist, at least the beginning of the war, and then what he wanted to do as part of the war effort?
Sure. Yeah, he basically loathed Wilson. I think Roosevelt was angry that Roosevelt, essentially was president during a time of, for the United States, relative peace. And here this college professor lucks into a global conflict. And it was a couple of years, about 2.5 years before the country will get into the war. Roosevelt wanted to get into the war earlier. And so he blamed the Wilson administration for that. Said when we were just, selling supplies to the Allies, it was blood money, and this was not an honorable thing to do. So he will be an extremely sharp critic of Roosevelt. There are some people, like another presidential candidate, Eugene V. Debs, who will spend time in prison for criticizing the government during the war. There's at least one U.S. senator who wrote a letter to another politician saying, you know what, Roosevelt, he's violating the law. With his criticism, maybe he should spend some time in jail as well. Everybody knew that wasn't going to happen. Roosevelt did go to Wilson on one occasion and ask if he could have a cavalry unit and he could go to the Western Front. So he tried to make nice there. Wilson said, look, it's 1917. We don't do that any longer, and we don't need a dead former president on the Western Front. Um, Roosevelt knew that he really wasn't physically up to it, but Roosevelt wanted that heroic moment. The French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, he wrote in Roosevelt's favor. He said, look, whether he survives or not, he will rally the boys. They'll get excited and they'll march into war with joy in their hearts. And there was some truth to that. So this was not a very edifying time for Roosevelt. He watched the Democratic Party reemerge as a force in national politics. He found himself outside of the war effort, and he was a critic of the Wilson administration until the day in January 1919 that he died. The war had just come to an end, and now he was all set to criticize Wilson and his proposals for peace and the 14 points. I don't think that there's anything that Wilson could have done in regards to peace that Roosevelt would have been in support for. By this time, Roosevelt was an oppositionist. He was a king without a crown, and he was very frustrated.
Yeah, and you mentioned he died in January of 1919 at the age of 60. And you mentioned earlier, and I remember seeing a poll very recently that he's still ranked very highly, always in the top five. This one poll I saw, I think he was ranked number four of the presidential, at least the perception from historians and others. Do you talk briefly about his legacy, and then we'll get to some of the questions?
Yeah, and to me, the big legacy is that he he's kind of a prototype for what's coming in America in the 20th and the 21st centuries. That is more of a regulatory state. His square deal, social welfare programs, that begins to establish a pattern. Would have happened anyway at some point, but it's very much attached to a popular presidential legacy. Unlike, for example, Lyndon Johnson, whose Great Society social welfare programs um, were muddied up because they were attached to his presidency, which was also attached, of course, to the Vietnam War, a very unpopular war. Um, and of course, there's Roosevelt's foreign policy, which is outward looking, it's imperialistic, and the so-called banana wars of the first 30 years of the 20th century. Again, I think that these are things that probably would have happened in some context, but attached to Roosevelt's charisma and popularity, they find a legitimacy that they may not have had otherwise. So oftentimes, Roosevelt's relative, Franklin Roosevelt, sort of gets the credit for being the president who really is kind of guiding the country towards the future with the Second World War and with the New Deal. But I think that this all sort of comes before that the Square Deal and that Roosevelt's foreign policy is pointing in the direction of what we would come to call the American century of social welfare liberalism and a foreign policy that's very outward looking and also looking to take territories and make alliances and extend American power to the Pacific.
And it also seems to me that he's one of the early presidents that really began to you kind of look at that as we refer to the imperial presidency, the growing power of that office. It's also a part of his mix. David, thank you so much. This is a wonderful discussion. We have time for some questions. Omar, if you want to jump back on and maybe read through a few of them for David.
Yeah, hi. So let's see. Let's look at some questions. Steve is curious about his favoring national health insurance in 1912 during his Progressive Party phase. If you can talk about that. Um,
Sure, yeah. Roosevelt was a great fan of workers. This came late in his presidency and also kind of late in his life. And he thought that that workers were the sort of the backbone of the country in terms of its labor force, particularly industrial workers, and that they needed certain benefits, including more secure healthcare. And so he becomes an advocate for this. And so what I was saying earlier about the square deal, about progressivism, this isn't part of it. This is a conversation that, of course, we're still having in 2025 about who should have healthcare and why they should have healthcare. But Roosevelt puts that out there. And it's one of the things that I think for the old guard, it just confirmed to them how far to the quote unquote left Roosevelt had gone. I might also say that there were not very many Democrats at that time that were advocating, something like this kind of progressive healthcare proposal.
Excellent. Laura has a question. Could you also speak to the contradictions in progressive values that he represented, such as support of women's suffrage and the common citizen versus his racist views about Native Americans and other people of color, both in the U.S. and abroad?
Yeah, he was very much a person of his times, and she's absolutely right. There's contradictions, particularly if we filter it through contemporary sensibilities. Um, in his own day, um, uh, he um, uh, he was in the majority of people, and I think of both men and women who were hesitant to think seriously about women's suffrage. Um, it's hard to tell exactly how self-serving he was, but he replied in one letter to a correspondent saying, you know, my wife is mildly for it, depending upon what day of the week you ask her for. And my sister, my eldest sister, is my great advisor. She's not really for it. He would kind of fall back upon that kind of a trope, but it was not a position that he could see was 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 embraced strongly by most people in his coalition. His views on race were, for their time, um, pretty contemporary. For our time, very backward. He engaged in what we would call scientific racism, believing that, science had demonstrated and proved that while Americans of all races could live together, there was this kind of social Darwinian, distinction and difference. He would also apply this to ethnic groups as well. Woodrow Wilson was also a progressive president and was a Southerner, and his views on race were at least as backward. So, I guess the question is, what do we mean when we talk about progressives? They were politically progressive. They don't meet our bar for being cultural progressives today, of course.
Absolutely. Stephanie asks, how would you characterize TR's Nobel Peace Prize? What was his goal in convening the peace conference in Portsmouth?
Yeah. Roosevelt liked to be part of the action, and Roosevelt thought that he had a legitimate opportunity to end the war between Russia and Japan. And of course, it turns out that he was right. Um, he, um, he did not engage in the negotiations. He met the Russians and he met the Japanese, helped to bring them together at a social function, and then up to Portsmouth. And he stayed back at Oyster Bay in New York, and they did the negotiations without him. Jeff mentioned earlier that Roosevelt ranks maybe around fourth in terms of presidential popularity polls. What I think is very ironic here is that the people who are typically ahead of him, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, these are people associated with war, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and of course the Second World War. So here's Roosevelt, rhetorically belligerent, strenuous life, a war hero before his presidency, but he gets the Nobel Prize for helping to bring peace in this great conflict between these two powerful nations.
And we'll end with this question. What qualities of leadership can politicians, or really anyone, I'll add, today draw from Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeah, I think that Roosevelt was a fundamentally honest person. Um, uh, there can be some self-deception, as there is with all of us. And maybe this is also part of the time. We live in a very, very divisive time. There wasn't a lot of social media back then. But I think that in in being a political independent, or seeing himself as a political independent, he thought that he could be sort of not a politician, it's a dirty word, a statesman who could bring people together because they would have trust in him because he wasn't just a partisan hack. And so if he could, for example, be a Republican, and yet move against monopolization, be a trust buster, for example, then that would show Americans he was fundamentally interested in them, in issues and questions like affordability and fair play, and who can get jobs in this industrial economy. So I think he worked very hard to do that. I think also, I think Roosevelt was charismatic. I think he was a natural leader. Former president of Harvard University said, I had met 6 US presidents. Roosevelt's the only one who basically, when he walks in the room, everybody knows he's there. He's a bit of a peacock, but wherever he goes, it seems people want to follow. So that can be a little bit dangerous too. But if you have someone who is trying to be fundamentally honest and scoping out two poles and seeking to bring people together, and also has the charisma to maybe pull it off, it's a very powerful thing.
Excellent. So we'll close it out there. Thank you so much, David. This was an excellent conversation. And thanks to our executive director for being our moderator this evening.
Happy to be a part of it, David. Thank you so much. It was great chatting with you again.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Amar. I enjoyed it. Thanks to all the people out there too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks all. Have a great evening.
Good night.
Take care.